Thatcher Hale slid the burner into his inner pocket, but it kept vibrating like a panicked heartbeat, and when he glanced down one last time, he saw 17 missed calls from Graham Phelps and a blunt text that read, "If you're not at the exchange in 10 minutes, you're done." Because in Thatcher's world, done didn't mean a lost deal. It meant a body, a ruined empire, and a federal tail closing in fast. And he should have kept moving, should have cut through the crowd and disappeared into the steel and glass of downtown Chicago, should have protected the shipment ledger that could bury him alive, but instead he stopped, because on the edge of the sidewalk outside a warm little bakery, where the smell of butter and sugar didn't belong to people like her, Naomi Reyes stood with 2 daughters pressed against her coat, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights and hunger she wouldn't admit. One girl older than her years watching him like she'd learned the city's predators by their shoes, the smaller one wheezing softly, as if every breath had to be negotiated. And Thatcher's gaze dropped to those tiny sneakers rubbed thin and damp from slush, to knees that had learned cold too early, and he heard himself ask, "Have they eaten?" And the question startled him more than any gun ever had, because it wasn't strategy, it was instinct, and Naomi tightened her grip on both girls, pulling the wheezing Rowan closer to her chest like a shield, her chin lifting with a pride that didn't beg and didn't thank, only warned. "We don't need pity, we just need a direction that won't get us hurt." And Thatcher gave a slow nod, then did the one thing his men would have called weakness, and his enemies would have called leverage. He crossed the street toward the bakery's back door, voice low like an order he couldn't take back. "Come with me. 5 minutes. That's all." And right then, the burner buzzed again with another message. "They're moving on the drop," and Thatcher didn't look at the screen, because for the first time in years, the most dangerous thing in his hands wasn't a weapon, it was a choice. So if this hook pulled you in, hit like to support the channel, share it with someone who loves slow burn twists, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And if you think you already know what kind of man Thatcher Hale is, listen a little longer, because the reason he can't walk away from Naomi and her girls is darker than anyone on that street could imagine. The back door of the bakery clicked shut behind them like a lid, temporarily sealing out the traffic noise and the footsteps flowing past on the street. Thatcher didn't scan the room like someone who was lost. He looked around like someone measuring blind spots. He chose a tucked-away table near the hallway leading to the restrooms, the kind of place a camera usually only swept past out of habit, then leaned in and told Naomi to sit down, just for a few minutes. His voice wasn't pleading and it wasn't commanding. It sounded like a decision that had been settled in his head long before he spoke. Naomi stayed standing, one arm locked tight around Rowan, the other keeping Maisie pressed close at her side, as if the city would swallow both girls the second she loosened her hold. Her eyes stayed on him, sharp with caution, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she'd lived too long with the rule that anything free always came with a hook. Thatcher didn't push. He walked to the counter and didn't order anything complicated, only spoke fast and clear. A cup of warm water, a light hot soup, 2 soft rolls and a carton of milk. Add napkins and 1 more small cup. The girl behind the counter nodded quickly, like she was afraid to slow down someone who shouldn't be slowed. Maisie still didn't sit. She stood slightly in front of her mother, her small shoulders drawn tight like a shield, her eyes flicking from the glass door to the street and back to Thatcher's hands, then up to his collar, as if she were searching for the outline of a knife or a hidden gun. Rowan wheezed, each breath dragging a thin rasp behind it. Naomi patted her back softly, but fear made her hands shake. Thatcher set the tray down on the table, not pushing it straight toward them, but sliding it close to Naomi, just enough for her to see he wasn't trying to crowd her. He had briefly stepped out to his vehicle to retrieve a specialized medical kit, one he kept stocked with advanced respiratory supplies for his team's exposure to smoke or chemical irritants, and from a sealed compartment. He pulled out a small new blue inhaler, placed it beside the cup of warm water, and said it was for bronchospasms. If Rowan had used one before, she'd know what to do. If she hadn't, he'd call an ambulance. Naomi stared at the inhaler like it was a confession. She swallowed hard, her eyes reddening with a mix of shame and relief. And finally she whispered that her child had used one before, but it had been gone for a long time. Thatcher nodded. He didn't ask why it was gone. He didn't ask where the money was. He didn't ask where her husband was. He only said to give it to her. Naomi pulled Rowan tighter, pressed one puff into her mouth with the instinct of a mother who'd already spent sleepless nights listening to breath, and Rowan coughed a few times before easing. her small shoulders dropping as if someone had handed her a little air back. Naomi lifted the warm water and let her drink in careful sips. Only then did she sit down, but on the edge of the chair, her back still straight, like someone ready to spring up at any second. Thatcher sat across from her, not beside her. His hands rested on the table, empty, not reaching toward them, as if he were proving the boundary with his own palms. He told her to eat. Naomi lowered her head, pulled the rolls closer to the girls, and let Maisie choose first. A small ritual, so the child would remember she still had the right to decide. Maisie didn't eat right away. She broke off a small piece and gave it to Rowan first, then finally took a bite herself, her eyes never leaving the door. Thatcher watched that, and something inside him, something as hard as steel, scraped against itself. It didn't hurt in a clean way, but it unsettled him, because it reminded him there were children who weren't allowed to be carefree. And then the burner in his pocket vibrated again, light as a fishhook tug, pulling him back toward the drop point. He didn't pull it out to read. He only let his gaze drift toward the corner of the room and saw two men outside on the street, glance in through the glass, and then turn away. Their eyes weren't the eyes of men buying bread. Thatcher knew they were marking the area. He breathed in slowly. In his mind, a cold line of calculation ran. If he took Naomi and the two girls out the front door, they'd become a moving trail. If he kept them here too long, this bakery would turn into a hot point. He needed to cut the tail without turning a mother and her children into targets. Thatcher stood up, left a few bills under the tray, enough that no one would dare complain, then bent down and spoke to Naomi in a low voice, telling her to stay here a little longer. Let the girls finish eating and warm up. Don't look at the door. Don't use the phone. If anyone asked, say she didn't know who he was. Naomi looked up, her gaze sharp as a needle with the sensitivity of someone who'd been hunted before, and she asked where he was going. Thatcher only answered, short and flat, that he had to make sure her little girl could breathe for longer than 5 minutes. Then he walked toward the counter like he was just another customer, but when he slipped back out through the rear doorway, the whole room seemed to hold its breath for one beat. Maisie watched him go, and in her eyes lived a question bigger than hunger, whether that man would come back or vanish like every good thing this city had ever promised before it swallowed it whole. Thatcher stepped out through the back door and immediately blended into the flow of people like a shadow that knew how to pick its rhythm. He didn't turn to look at the bakery. He didn't let a single movement say there was something inside he cared about. His hand slid over his wrist like he was adjusting a watch, but he was really touching a small device that felt cold as ice, the kind he used to send a short signal without ever opening his burner. Then he cut through the alley beside the shop, where the wind slapped the stink of trash and dirty snow into his face. And at the end of that alley sat a metal dumpster, where the drop point was hidden beneath a layer of cardboard. He stopped not right in front of it, but far enough back to catch reflections in the glass of the store across the street. In that reflection were the two men from before. They weren't standing in the same place anymore. They'd split like a set of pincers, one pretending to scroll his phone, the other smoking, their eyes slicing over the mouth of the alley like a knife sweeping for skin. Thatcher understood at once. This wasn't federal surveillance with procedures and paperwork. These were rival men, the kind who didn't need orders to act. And he understood something else that made his chest go cold. The drop had been breathed on, touched, because if it were still clean, they wouldn't be here waiting. He didn't bend to open the dumpster. He didn't touch anything at all. He took one more step like he might toss something, then changed direction and walked around a parked delivery van. His mind was already building the map. If he took the package right now, they'd follow him. And if they followed him, they'd trace him back to the bakery, back to Naomi, back to two little girls, and turn them into a knot that would drag him into the light. Thatcher swallowed a curse and pressed a signal. 3 short pulses, 3 long, his code for the legitimate security line, meaning lock the area like a routine safety inspection. No sirens, no guns, just enough controlled confusion to force people to shift positions. Then he angled back toward the main street and passed the bakery windows once, not looking inside, but his eyes caught a detail that made him want to turn back immediately. A man stood at the counter in a dark coat with his collar pulled up, taking a bag of bread, tilting his head to stare toward the corner table. He stared too long, stared like he was memorizing. Naomi saw him too, because Thatcher had told her not to look at the door, but the instincts of someone who'd slept outdoors wouldn't let her obey all the way. She could tell he didn't look like a customer buying pastry. He looked like someone checking inventory. Maisie saw it as well. The girl pulled in close to her chair and set her piece of bread down like she was hiding evidence. Naomi tightened her hold on Rowan, her heart pounding with that familiar sense of being singled out. And in that same moment, Thatcher walked back in. Not rushing, not running. He opened the door like a man who'd suddenly remembered he'd left his wallet. But his eyes weren't lost anymore. They were the eyes of someone who decided who got to breathe and who didn't. He went straight to the counter and stood right behind the man, close enough that his shadow fell over the other's shoulder. When the man glanced sideways, Thatcher didn't say much. He only tipped his head slightly as if in greeting. But inside that small motion lived a warning. A cold reminder that there were people you didn't stare at for too long. The man stiffened. His lips pressed together. His hand tightened on the paper bag. He tried to smile like nothing was wrong, but his eyes had changed. Thatcher handed cash to the clerk, his voice normal in a ruthless way, and asked for one more soup to go. Then he looked straight at the man without blinking and said, soft as if he were talking about the weather, that he'd advise him to leave before someone misunderstood. There was no crude threat, only a certainty that made the other man understand every bad road had already been calculated. The man swallowed, stepped back, then turned and moved fast. The bell over the door rang out sharp. Naomi sat rigid as stone, blood roaring in her ears. She didn't know who Thatcher was, but she knew the feeling when a man entered a room and the temperature automatically changed, when one stare could make a stranger retreat without a hand ever being raised. Thatcher walked toward their table. He didn't sit. He only bent low so Naomi could hear, and told her she and the girls were leaving through the back door. Right now, no arguing. Naomi opened her mouth to ask why, but the sound stuck in her throat, because she'd just seen through the glass a black car parked crooked, engine still running, and two shapes inside waiting. Her fear finally had a shape. It wasn't hunger or cold anymore. It was something sharp, quiet, and deliberate. And in the moment, she pulled Rowan up into her arms and stood, with Maisie gripping her mother's hand hard. Naomi understood that this man wasn't only dangerous because he could hurt people. He was dangerous because he could pull danger toward anyone who stood too close to him. Thatcher guided them out through the back door as if every step had already been measured. He didn't walk pressed up against Naomi. He kept slightly to the outside, so if anyone saw them, they'd only see a man clearing a path, not someone escorting a captive. The alley's cold slapped Rowan in the face and made her cough dryly, and Naomi immediately tightened her thin coat around her, wrapping it closer. Pride inside her still wanted to say no, still wanted to find her own way, but the fear that had finally taken shape had its grip around her throat. Maisie clung to her mother's hand, eyes cutting toward the end of the alley like she was counting the distance to the nearest hiding place. Thatcher didn't lead them to any black car. He cut across a small parking lot and pushed them toward an ordinary silver sedan, the kind of car you might rent without thinking. No tinted windows, no arrogant plates, an interior that didn't smell like expensive cologne, only cold leather and a faint cleanser. Naomi looked at him like a blade testing truth and asked who he was. Thatcher didn't answer. He only told her to buckle the girls in. When Naomi hesitated, he set the keys on the dashboard like a sign that she could open the door whenever she wanted. But if she wanted her child to breathe in peace, she should listen. His voice wasn't gentle, but there was discipline in its coldness that made a person believe he wasn't planning anything filthy right now. The car rolled out. Thatcher chose ugly streets, turned into darker stretches to avoid intersection cameras, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to be followed. Naomi held Rowan and felt her breathing settle into a steadier rhythm with the inhaler. But every time the car stopped at a red light, Naomi's stomach clenched with the fear of a hand rapping on the glass. Maisie watched the city through the thin gap of light like someone much older than her face, her expression tight with an adult's vigilance. When the car turned into a low row of motels on the edge of a quieter neighborhood, the yellow sign blinking like it was tired, Naomi reacted instantly. She said she wasn't going in. She wasn't following a man into a room. She wasn't bringing her children into a place like that. Her voice came out sharp and choked at the same time. Thatcher parked in a tucked-away corner and looked straight at her. He didn't argue in circles. He said it was a clean motel, just for tonight. He wouldn't go into the room. She would lock the door from the inside. If she wanted to leave, she could leave any time. But out there, someone was looking around for his trail. And if she stepped onto the street with two little girls in this cold, she'd turn herself into the easiest sign for predators to follow. Naomi bit her lip, her hand squeezing so hard her knuckles went white. Pride struck fear like two opposing currents. Rowan rested her head on her mother's shoulder, eyes closed, her breathing still wheezy but less panicked. Naomi knew she could force herself through 1 more hour, 2 more hours, but her child couldn't. Maisie tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve, not saying the word please, only looking up with the eyes of a child who was already used to choosing the less terrible option. Thatcher got out first. He didn't open Naomi's door like a romantic gesture, but like a tactical one. He walked straight to the front desk, set down a card and a name that didn't belong to him, signed fast, like someone who'd done this too many times, then came back with a room key and a small bag holding water, tissues, and a basic fever reducer. He gave the key to Naomi by placing it into her palm without touching her hand, and he laid out the rules clearly. Don't open the door for anyone unless she looked through the peephole and called the front desk to confirm. Don't pull the curtains. Don't leave the bathroom light on for too long. If she heard footsteps stop outside the door, turn everything off and call this number. He read out a short string of digits and told her to repeat it. Naomi repeated it in a hoarse voice, like she was writing down an exit. Thatcher watched the hallway, the fluorescent light washing the old beige walls. He didn't like this place because it didn't belong to his clean world, but it was anonymous enough to hide them for one night. He walked them to the door and stopped a step back, letting Naomi open it herself, letting her step inside on her own as a way of keeping her control. Maisie pulled Rowan in first, then turned and looked back at him. Her eyes weren't only wary anymore. There was something else there, something strange, like she was trying to measure whether he was a devil or a wall. Thatcher only gave a small nod. No promises, no comfort. And the moment Naomi locked the door, he turned and went straight down the hall, not pausing to listen to the latch, not standing guard like an owner. He left quickly and quietly, but before he reached the parking lot, he'd already sent a wordless instruction through his network to clamp down on every risk trailing this corridor, so any shadow that dared to linger would be seen before Naomi even realized she was being hunted again. Thatcher left the motel in the silver sedan like a man who'd stopped by somewhere forgettable, but inside his head, everything was being recorded like a field report. He didn't drive straight back toward the center. He looped around a canal route where black water slapped the shore like a reminder that Chicago always had a submerged face. Then he switched vehicles in a lot owned by a logistics company that served as one of his legitimate shells, climbed into a dark SUV, peeled off his outer jacket, and replaced it with another clean-smelling one, like he was stripping the bakery and the motel off his body. It didn't erase the truth that he'd just created a soft point in a life made of nothing but sharp angles. When he neared the old drop area, he didn't go back into the alley. He stopped on a parallel street and watched through internal security camera feeds he could access remotely. The figures had mostly pulled back, but the quiet didn't settle him. It felt like the quiet after prey had already been dragged out of the trap. He signaled one of his people to approach the dumpster while pretending to be city sanitation, not to retrieve the package, but to confirm what his gut already knew. Minutes later, a short message came back. The cardboard layer had been disturbed. There was fresh adhesive. There were streaks from nitrile gloves, not the dirty hand marks of someone digging through trash, but the precise handling marks of a professional who knew exactly where the package sat and how to reset it so a casual glance would still read untouched. Thatcher clenched his jaw until the muscle jumped, because in his world, only an insider would know the packing rules and the dead placement for tonight, and that meant either someone had sold him out, or someone was staging a play to make him slip his own neck into a noose. The burner in his hand vibrated again, not an urgent code this time, but a call from Graham Phelps. Thatcher answered without a greeting, and just listened. Graham's voice was cold and fast, like a man reading an indictment. He said the partner board was waiting for signatures to transfer the logistics lane and the security contract, and because Thatcher had vanished, they'd shifted to a contingency plan. If they lost this deal, it wouldn't just be money. They'd lose a critical, legitimate shell, lose access to a clean dock, lose the ability to prove lawful cash flow for the next few quarters, and meanwhile, federal agents were asking for expanded authority to squeeze deeper into the company. Thatcher listened without blinking, not because he didn't care, but because he was weighing something more dangerous than money. If the legitimate cover tore, the bones of his underworld would show, and then it wouldn't just be rivals who tore at him, but the law itself. Graham asked where he was. Thatcher only said he was handling an internal problem. When Graham started in on legal exposure, on how Thatcher needed to appear and sign at least one page to keep the door open, Thatcher cut him off, and asked flatly whether anyone besides Mason Vargo knew tonight's drop. The line went quiet for a beat, long enough for Thatcher to hear Graham's breath being held back. Then Graham said the schedule for tonight had only been sent to 3 people inside the circle: Thatcher, Mason, and a route coordinator. The coordinator had just reported a signal loss. Thatcher stared through the windshield at the city lights sliding past like a ribbon of hot metal. He didn't need more proof. The picture assembled itself. Mason was the only one close enough to know, ambitious enough to betray, and skilled enough to cover it. Thatcher didn't speak Mason's name out loud yet, because a traitor rarely moved alone. He needed a buyer. He needed someone waiting on the other end, and he'd grow bolder if he thought Thatcher was distracted. Thatcher ended the call, issued a short instruction to his legitimate security team to lock down the warehouse doors under the cover of an internal inspection, and ordered another man to locate the coordinator who'd gone dark, not to rescue him, but to confirm Thatcher's eyes had been cut. Then he leaned back and let his eyes close for a single second, and in that second, the image of Naomi holding Rowan in the motel hallway flashed in his mind like light in the wrong place. He realized the newest weakness wasn't the legitimate deal sliding away or the ledger going reactive. It was a woman who hadn't begged and 2 little girls fighting for breath, because if Mason truly had turned, he wouldn't only strike at money and shipping lanes. He'd strike at the one thing that had made Thatcher stop for the first time, and Thatcher hated it most when someone was allowed to touch a boundary he hadn't finished building. In the motel room that smelled of bleached sheets and the dry breath of a heater, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed like someone who didn't dare let her back touch the mattress. Rowan had fallen into sleep with her mouth slightly open, still worn out after the wheezing spell. Maisie lay on her side beside her sister, one hand still resting on the blanket like she was standing guard. Naomi looked at her girls and didn't let herself cry out loud, because tears were a luxury when you'd lived too long in a state where one slip could drag you off the shore. She'd just finished washing her hands when the old phone in her coat pocket vibrated, not the quick buzz of a text, but the long insistence of a call. Naomi froze. Her heart slammed hard because she was used to every call being a bill, a collector, a voice from the past pulling her back. But she still lifted it to her ear. Priya Desai's voice came through, calm, but with a tightness at the end of her phrases, like someone trying not to let panic leak into the room. Priya said, "Naomi, I need you to listen carefully. The school has sent an absence report, and because you don't have a stable address on file, the system could automatically push this to CPS Child Protective Services. I'm trying to keep it at the level of family support, but I can't hold it forever if you keep disappearing." Naomi tightened her grip on the phone, her throat dry and raw. She looked at her girls and lowered her voice so far it felt like she was trying not to wake her own fear. She said she was fine. She had somewhere to sleep tonight. She'd bring the girls to school. Priya didn't interrupt. Priya only asked for an address, asked about paperwork, asked whether Rowan had a doctor appointment lined up. The moment Naomi heard the word paperwork, something inside her yanked backward. Her eyes flicked to the small bag in the corner where she kept her whole life compressed into a few changes of clothes and a wrinkled stack of documents she was always afraid to open in front of anyone, because inside were the missing things and the wrong things. A blurry photocopy of a birth certificate, an expired insurance card, a clinic letter listing an unpaid balance, and an old court paper she'd folded until it had gone soft as cloth, the one that carried the name of a man she didn't want to read again. Naomi told Priya she was trying to sort it out, that she had been working, that she wasn't neglecting her kids. Her voice stayed level, but her other hand was shaking, because she could still feel the way hospital staff asked for ID and an address, then stepped aside to speak quietly to each other, then looked back at her with eyes that held pity and suspicion at the same time. She remembered the night Rowan started coughing in a temporary shelter, and Naomi hadn't dared call an ambulance because she was terrified they'd ask why her child didn't have a family doctor, why her address was blank, why the mother had old bruises on her wrist and no explanation. She was afraid the system wouldn't see love in the way she held her child. It would only see empty boxes on a form and write a cold conclusion. Priya said, "Naomi, I don't want CPS entering your life that way. I want you to give me something concrete. An address, a stable school routine, a medical plan. Anything I can document to show you're stabilizing." Naomi bit her lip until she tasted blood. She watched Rowan sleep and listened to her breathing, steadier now. She pictured strangers lifting her child out of her arms, heard Maisie screaming for her in panic, and in her mind flashed the old image of that man, a heavy shadow blocking a cheap doorway, breath thick with alcohol, the threat that she couldn't raise kids on her own, that she'd end up coming back. Naomi dragged in a deep breath and told Priya she'd come to the office tomorrow morning, that she'd take the girls to school if she could. Priya's tone softened slightly. She said she'd keep the file in support status for a very short time longer, but Naomi had to give her proof of stability. When the call ended, Naomi sat completely still, eyes fixed on the beige wall, like if she stared long enough, it would turn into a road. She didn't dare wake Maisie, but Maisie had already opened her eyes. The girl sat up and didn't ask who Priya was or what CPS meant. She only looked at her mother and whispered, "Don't let them take us." The sentence landed like a thin blade. Naomi pulled her into her arms and held her so tight they felt fused together, then forced herself to stand, checked the lock, drew the curtains, and slid the bag of papers under her pillow like an old defensive habit, because she'd lived long enough to know the most dangerous thing wasn't cold or hunger. It was a stamp on paper that could decide whether she was still the mother of 2 little girls or not. And that night she didn't sleep. She only sat beside the bed and listened to every breath, like if she watched closely enough, if she held on hard enough, morning would come before the system could reach into her life again. Before the sky had fully lightened, Naomi was already awake. She washed her face with cold water, smoothed her hair back as if she could straighten the last scraps of dignity still clinging to her, then woke Maisie with a gentle touch and told her to watch her sister while Naomi went downstairs to ask for more warm water. Maisie nodded without questions, her eyes shadowed with dark circles but alert like an adult's. Naomi had barely opened the door when she heard soft footsteps in the motel hallway. Not rushed, not heavy. And then a knock came. Only 2 taps. Enough for the person inside to hear clearly, but not enough to draw attention. Naomi went still. Her whole body tightened like a wire. Her hand moved on instinct toward the bag of papers under the pillow, and memories of doors kicked in flooded up. But then Thatcher's voice slipped through the crack, low and even, telling her to open up. "It's me." Naomi pressed her eye to the peephole and saw him standing a short distance back, both hands visible, not hidden in his pockets. A clean, dark coat that didn't carry the motel smell, and most important, he was alone. Naomi unlocked the door but kept the safety chain latched, opening it only enough to see. Thatcher didn't try to look inside. He set a paper bag on the floor right in front of the door, stepped back 1 pace like a rule, and said he'd brought a few necessities. Naomi glanced into the bag and saw a carton of milk, soft bread, a small bottle of saline, a few instant porridge packets, a warm child's jacket, and a basic fever medicine. Nothing luxurious, just exactly what a mother like her was missing. She wanted to refuse because the feeling of owing anyone made her skin burn, but Rowan coughed softly in the room behind her, and that sound dragged Naomi back to reality. Naomi opened the door a little wider, pulled the bag inside, and still stood in the doorway like she was holding back a flood. She asked what he wanted. Thatcher met her eyes without detours. He said she needed something that wasn't bread or medicine. She needed a stable address, a stable routine, and paperwork strong enough that nobody from CPS could take scissors to her life and cut her away from her girls with a single line. The moment Naomi heard CPS, her heart dropped for a beat. She forced her face to stay hard and told him he didn't know anything about her life. Thatcher said he didn't need to know. He only needed to know the system would grind her down if she stood alone with 2 children and an empty file. Naomi stepped back half a pace, her eyes dimming. Priya's voice flashed in her mind. The warning, the picture of a social worker's hands turning pages the way people turn fate. Naomi said he could help for 1 night, 2 nights, but he couldn't buy her life. Thatcher's brow tightened slightly, like he hated the word buy more than he hated an old gun. He said he wasn't buying her pride. He had no need for that. What he was offering was structure. She worked, she got paid, she had a contract, she had an address, she had medical records for her child, she had paperwork that could win. Naomi gave a dry laugh that held no joy. She said working for him, living in his house, wasn't that just a cage? Thatcher didn't deny it right away. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze cold but not dirty. Then he said, "A cage is something that locks. This would have a door. She would have the right to leave, and he would put that right on paper." Naomi gripped the doorframe hard. She wanted to believe him, but she had believed before, and paid for it. She asked what job. Thatcher said housekeeping and property care at a real estate asset owned by his company. Legitimate work, weekly pay, clear hours, nobody allowed to touch her, nobody allowed to talk to her outside of work, and if anything was wrong, she would report directly to his lawyer. When Naomi heard lawyer, safety and fear surged together, because lawyers meant paperwork, signatures, and the thing that had once stripped her bare. Thatcher said the name Graham Phelps, then held out a thin envelope. Inside was a draft employment contract and a letter confirming a pending job offer. No flashy logo, only clean printed text. Naomi stared at it like a road she'd never walked. She said she didn't know who he was, that he was dangerous, that he dragged danger close to her. Thatcher didn't argue. He nodded once, admitting it with silence, then said yes, and that was exactly why she needed structure. If she kept running, CPS would find her before his enemies found him, and she would lose her children for a reason that had nothing to do with how much she loved them. Naomi felt her throat tighten because he was right in the most brutal way. She asked what he got out of this. Thatcher glanced down the empty hallway like he could hear footsteps that hadn't arrived yet, then looked back at her and said he got one quieter night until he cleaned up what was clinging to him, but she shouldn't misunderstand. He didn't save people because he liked being good. He only knew there were children who shouldn't be ripped from their mother just because they were poor. Naomi stood still. Pride inside her rose like a wall, but that wall was being drilled full of small holes by paperwork and CPS. She turned and looked at her daughters and saw Maisie holding Rowan on the bed, her child's eyes not pleading with Thatcher, only looking at her mother as if asking what she would choose. Naomi faced him again, her voice smaller but firm. She said she would read it, she would talk to Priya, and she wouldn't sign anything she didn't understand. Thatcher nodded and said that was exactly what she should do. Then he stepped back again, giving her the space so she wouldn't feel cornered. And in that moment, Naomi realized something had shifted shape. This wasn't just a hand offered and pulled away. It had become a boundary-marked agreement, where she was being forced to choose between lonely pride and a system she might be able to use to keep her two little girls inside her arms. Naomi didn't sign in the motel room. She carried the stack of papers down to the front desk and asked for a decent pen and a little more light, like clear light could make words less frightening. Then she called Priya Desai back, forcing her voice to stay calm, and said she had an opportunity for work and a temporary stable place to stay. She asked Priya what she needed to show the system that this wasn't another disappearance, but a planned step. Priya went quiet for a beat, then told Naomi not to sign anything vague, but if it was a legitimate employment contract with a clear address, a wage, work hours, and a job offer letter, it could help keep the file from sliding into an investigative mode. Priya added that Naomi needed to immediately re-enroll the girls with the right school zone or request a temporary transfer. She needed an appointment for Rowan, and she needed a mailing address. Naomi ended the call feeling like someone had placed a task list in her hands instead of a verdict. She returned to the room and read the pages line by line. Her eyes lingered on the section listing basic benefits and work rules, then lingered longer on the termination clause, because she was used to being held by debt and fear, not by terms. By noon, a car sent by Thatcher's people waited in the lot. The driver didn't offer a name. He simply took Naomi and the girls to a small, clean office inside a downtown building, where the sign carried the name of Thatcher's Logistics Company like it was any ordinary business. No dim lights, no visible tattoos, only a reception desk and the smell of new paper. Graham Phelps was already there. He didn't look friendly, but his voice was precise and sharp as a paper blade. He greeted Naomi by her last name, asked which clauses she wanted to review, and explained each section the way a modern American would explain an employment contract. Pay cycles, sick leave, worksite address, confidentiality tied to property and security, but also a clause protecting employees from harassment, an emergency contact number, and a section on the right to leave with notice. Graham didn't talk about feelings. He didn't talk about kindness. He talked about records, about proof of stability, about how a legitimate address and a steady schedule would allow Priya to document that Naomi was in a stabilization phase. He asked whether Naomi had identification. Naomi flushed and admitted she had copies and several missing items. Graham didn't react. He simply made a step-by-step list. Obtain certified copies of the girls' birth certificates. Secure social security cards if available. Open a mailbox for mail. Schedule Rowan's appointment to create continuous medical records. And most important, don't let there be another gap in address history. Naomi listened with her stomach tight. But for the first time, she felt a road that wasn't only running. Maisie stood beside her mother, watching Graham like a strict teacher, then glanced toward Thatcher when he entered the room. Thatcher didn't do small talk. He leaned against the edge of the table, his eyes sweeping the paperwork the way they'd sweep a weapon. Then he looked at Naomi and said, if she signed, everything started today. Naomi took the pen. Her hand didn't shake because she feared Thatcher. It shook because she understood that this signature would tie her to a world she didn't know. But if she didn't sign, CPS would tie her to a system far colder. She signed the name Naomi Reyes, each stroke like pulling a cord away from her throat, then signed the job confirmation letter. Graham handed her a copy and told her exactly how to present it to Priya and the school. Thatcher said they would move to the new place tonight. Naomi asked what the rules in his house were. Thatcher answered without softness. In his house, nobody touched her. Nobody asked about her personal life. Nobody spoke to her children unless she was present. And if anyone on his staff broke the rule, that person disappeared from the job immediately. He said it as calmly as changing a shift, but Naomi heard the cold behind it. She understood this wasn't a promise. It was a rule, and that was exactly why it felt more trustworthy. When they left the office, Maisie tugged at her mother's shirt and whispered that she would watch, that she wouldn't let him do anything to her mom. Naomi wanted to smile and couldn't. She felt pain and tenderness at once, because the girl was carrying a weight that shouldn't belong to a child. Naomi pulled Maisie into her arms for 1 second, then looked at Thatcher and saw that he'd heard the words. He didn't respond with anger. He responded with a steady look, like he accepted that in the too rich, too cold house they were about to enter, the first tension wouldn't come from enemies outside. It would come from a child's wounded trust and a mother's fear that refused to let go. By late afternoon, the car brought them to a tall building near the river, its glass face reflecting the gray sky like a cold mirror. Naomi sat pressed close to her girls in the back seat, one hand resting on Rowan's chest to feel that her breathing was still steady, while Maisie stared out the window, memorizing every turn the way a child memorizes escape routes. When the car rolled into the underground garage, the steel gate slid shut behind them with a heavy sound, and Naomi shivered because it sounded like a door locking. Thatcher didn't say much. He guided them to a private elevator, used a key card and a code, and the doors closed with a soft seal. There was no smell of grease, no human chatter, only clean metal and a quiet that made Naomi hear her own heartbeat more clearly. At the high floor, the doors opened to a hallway wrapped in thick carpet, lit by pale yellow lamps that didn't feel warm so much as museum calm. Thatcher opened the penthouse with one efficient movement. Inside was a wide space with thick floor-to-ceiling glass. The city spread below like a sea of lights you couldn't touch. Naomi stopped at the threshold, and the feeling of being out of place hit her like a wave, because her life before this had been shelters, cheap motels, damp clothes, and arguments bleeding through walls, and here everything was so clean, it made her afraid of being the dirt. She was afraid her footprints would ruin the carpet, afraid her child's breathing would crack the quiet. Thatcher pointed toward a smaller bedroom tucked in an inner corner and said that room was for Naomi and the girls. The door could be locked from the inside, and the rest of the penthouse was workspace. He added that someone would bring basic supplies tonight, but nobody would step inside unless she opened the door. Naomi didn't ask why he needed to say it so clearly. She only nodded, carried Rowan into the room, and laid her down as if placing something fragile onto Cloud. Rowan's eyes stayed closed, but her sleep was thin, her lips tightening now and then like she feared losing air. Naomi pulled the blanket up, set the inhaler and warm water beside the bed, then turned and found that Maisie had already slipped back out. The girl moved lightly across the wood floor like someone trespassing in a place that didn't belong to her, eyes sweeping corners, doors, glass walls. She reached a finger toward a small opening in the ceiling, then pulled it back and looked at her mother like she wanted to ask what it was. Naomi followed her gaze and saw the tiny dots like eyes, a security system, sensors, cameras. Naomi swallowed hard, because she was used to being watched in a way that judged her, but she'd never been used to being watched in a way that claimed to protect. The feeling was so unfamiliar, it almost scared her. Thatcher stood in the kitchen area and turned on a small lamp instead of flooding the whole place with light. He didn't want this home to become a stage, but the glow still revealed the exhaustion he kept strapped down with discipline. His phone didn't buzz openly. Instead, notifications pulsed on a screen built into the wall, an internal security feed logging anomalies, an unfamiliar car cruising slowly around the building twice before leaving, a signal scanning device appearing near the parking radius and then vanishing, a failed card attempt at the garage door. Small things like dust, but together they formed a bad grain. Thatcher stared at the lines, his eyes going darker. He knew someone was testing the edge of his protective ring, trying to drag him out of his control. And he knew what they needed wasn't a warehouse or a number. They needed a soft point to pull. Naomi stepped out of the bedroom, her hand still pulling her coat tighter without thinking, like she was trying to cover herself. She looked at Thatcher and asked quietly whether it was safe here. The question held no exclamation, but it carried a whole life of running. Thatcher answered, "As safe as it can be," not claiming perfect. Naomi heard those words and her chest tightened because she'd never had perfect, only temporary. Maisie stood behind her mother, not staring at the city lights beyond the glass, but staring at Thatcher, like she was measuring whether he would lock their door from the outside. Thatcher noticed and told Maisie that their room door could be locked. The key stayed inside, and nobody except her mother was allowed to open it. Maisie didn't say thank you. She only asked what if someone came. Thatcher said she should look through the peephole, and if she didn't want to open it, she shouldn't. If she got scared, she should call the number taped to the desk phone. The answer was cold but clear, and it made Maisie fall silent for a moment. Naomi turned away and looked out at the city, beautiful and distant, and a thought rose that made her skin prickle. If someone wanted Thatcher, they would follow what he'd just brought home. They would follow her and the girls. Naomi felt an invisible hand settle on her shoulder, not squeezing in pain, but heavy. And Thatcher, standing in that polished space, reading the warnings on his system, understood the same thing. This safe property had just gained something that made it more dangerous. Not because Naomi had done anything wrong, but because her very existence in his life had created a trail an enemy could follow to drag him into the light. The next morning, Naomi woke before the sky had time to change color. The penthouse was so quiet she could hear the heater running softly, and the uneven thread of Rowan's breathing, thin and breakable. Naomi warmed water, checked the inhaler, folded blankets, wiped away small footprints on the floor like every mark was evidence against her, then started working the way someone works to repay a chance she was terrified would be taken back at any moment. She wiped the kitchen, wiped the glass, straightened things that were already straight, cleaned corners nobody would ever look at, because inside her head lived an old voice that said if she wasn't perfect, people would have a reason to throw her out. Maisie woke and stood in the bedroom doorway watching her mother move back and forth, her eyes full of worry like she was watching someone burn herself up to keep everyone else warm. Naomi told her to get ready for school, forcing her tone to sound normal, but the moment she said school, her stomach tightened, because school wasn't only classrooms. It was paperwork. Questions about an address, a guardian, insurance, blank boxes that made her feel ashamed, like poverty was a crime. Thatcher appeared on time like a clock. He didn't bring coffee or soft small talk. He brought a thin file and a written schedule with everything laid out. When to take the girls to school, when to meet Priya, when to call the clinic and set Rowan's appointment, when Naomi worked, when Naomi rested. He set the papers on the table and told her she wasn't going to overdo it. She was going to do the right amount. Naomi lifted her head and pride jumped up on instinct. She said she didn't need anyone teaching her how to work. Thatcher didn't argue. He only said she needed to survive longer than 1 week here. She needed enough strength to keep her children. If she burned out, she would make a mistake, and the system only needed one mistake to push her out. That hit exactly where she was most afraid. Naomi went rigid, because it wasn't the exhaustion that terrified her. It was a small error being turned into proof that she wasn't fit to be a mother. They went down to the lobby. Naomi wore the borrowed coat, her hands gripping the stack of papers like a life ring. Maisie walked beside her mother holding Rowan's hand, and Rowan clung to Naomi's collar like it was the only certain place left in the world. At the school office, Naomi stood at the counter and listened to the staff member ask for her current address and who was responsible. She answered in a small voice, her face burning as she admitted she'd just moved and didn't yet have every document in place. And she saw the staff member's gaze slide over her simple clothes and pause on Maisie's shoes. Shame rose like an old wave. Naomi wanted to retreat, wanted to say forget it. She'd figure it out alone, but Thatcher stepped forward at the right moment. He didn't push in. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed the employment confirmation letter and the housing lease on the counter, like a man who understood process. He introduced himself as Naomi's employer, spoke in the calm tone of business, confirmed her schedule allowed school drop-offs and pickups, confirmed a contact address, and requested the school expedite the transfer paperwork to avoid academic disruption. The school employee's attitude shifted immediately, not because Thatcher was kinder than Naomi, but because his documents were clean and his voice carried weight. Naomi stood beside him, feeling both rescued and erased. She saw clearly how the system softened for people with structure and hardened for people who only had raw truth. On the way back to the car, Naomi told him she didn't need him stepping in like that forever. Thatcher said he wouldn't step in forever. He would step in until she could stand on her own, but to get there, she had to accept discipline and boundaries. Naomi heard the word boundaries and felt her throat tighten, because in her life, boundaries had always been something pushed onto her, not something she chose for herself. That night, when the girls were asleep, Naomi sat at the kitchen table staring at Thatcher's schedule, staring at the blocks of time like invisible bars. She knew she needed them to survive CPS and the school's gaze, but she also knew that if she wasn't careful, she'd get used to another man deciding the rhythm of her life. And in that thick glass penthouse, under the far-off city lights, Naomi understood for the first time that protection could be a warm coat, but it could also become a leash if she didn't hold on to her own agency with boundaries she set herself. That night, Chicago's wind rose, the kind that slid through the seams of thick glass like a reminder the city never truly softened. Naomi was folding the paperwork for her morning appointment with Priya when she heard Rowan cough once, long. Then again, the sound dry and harsh like someone dragging sand through her throat. Naomi shot up and ran into the bedroom. Rowan was curled in on herself, eyes wide, chest rising and falling too fast, her lips starting to pale. Naomi grabbed the inhaler and pressed one puff, then another. Rowan pulled air in with difficulty, like she was trying to breathe through a narrow straw. Naomi forced her voice to stay calm and told her it was okay. Mom's here. But her hands were shaking so badly the cap of the inhaler tapped Rowan's teeth with a sharp click. Maisie woke, bolted upright, looked at her sister, then at her mother, panic flooding her eyes. Naomi tugged the blanket, tugged a sweater, rubbed Rowan's back. But Rowan's breathing didn't ease. It whistled tight, like a strangled siren. In that moment, an older fear rose up stronger than the asthma itself. Fear of the hospital, fear of the intake desk, fear of questions about an address, insurance, a father, fear that someone would glance at a file and call CPS because a child was gasping and her mother didn't have a family doctor. Naomi stumbled into the main space with Rowan in her arms, her other hand hunting for her phone. She thought of calling Priya, but knew Priya wouldn't pick up at this hour. She thought of calling emergency services and stopped because her mind screamed that an ambulance siren would pull eyes toward her, pull paperwork toward her, pull a cold hand toward her children and away from her arms. Thatcher appeared in the doorway like he'd been standing there already. In truth, he'd only been checking the security system because of scattered alerts through the evening, but Rowan's coughing pulled him faster than any warning. He took one look and understood. He didn't ask questions. He didn't lecture. He only said, "Get her coat on. We're going now." Naomi shook her head on reflex and said she couldn't go to the hospital. They would ask. They would call. The words breaking into shards of fear. Thatcher stepped closer, but still stopped at a distance that didn't make her feel cornered. He said if she hesitated, Rowan would lose oxygen, and the system would have even more reason to intervene. She wouldn't win by hiding. She would win by doing the right thing and building a record. Naomi looked at Rowan, saw the child fighting for each inhale, shoulders lifting, eyes wet. Naomi knew she was out of choices. She nodded once like she was nodding into a drop. Thatcher made a short call, not on the burner but on another device, his voice low as he gave a location, a code, and said the emergency room needed to be ready. No siren, no extra notes. Then he guided them to the private elevator, bypassing the main lobby. A car was already waiting in the garage, not a luxury one, still the plain silver sedan. Thatcher didn't carry Rowan. He let Naomi carry her, like he was letting her keep her right to be a mother even in panic. But he opened the door, set a small medical kit on the front seat, and told Maisie to sit close to her mother to steady her sister. The car moved out. No flashing lights, no movie speed, but every intersection light seemed to open, every barrier seemed to yield. Naomi understood it wasn't magic. It was power directed through networks and phones. At the hospital, they didn't go through the crowded main entrance. The car turned into a secondary intake route, where a medical staffer already waited with a gurney. Nobody asked long questions. They asked a name, an age, symptoms. Naomi answered with her throat tight. Thatcher stood behind her without touching her, but his presence alone seemed to reorganize the hallway. A guard glanced at him and opened a door immediately. A nurse checked the board and moved faster. Naomi felt relief and fear at the same time, because she understood that here, just like at the school, the world got softer when you stood beside someone with weight. Rowan was taken into a room, a pulse oximeter clipped onto her finger. The steady beep sounded like a rope, pulling Naomi back from the edge. The doctor started nebulizer treatment and asked about medical history. Naomi stumbled over words, terrified a single mistake would be written down as a weapon. Thatcher spoke at the right moment. He said the guardian was Naomi Reyes. She had employment and a stable address, and they would provide insurance documentation and contractual proof as soon as needed. His voice stayed flat, like he was reading a report. The doctor nodded and kept working. Nobody looked at Naomi like a runaway anymore. Naomi stood beside the bed and watched Rowan's breathing slow under the nebulizer mask. Gratitude rising so hot it made her want to break and sob, and right behind it came a cold wash, because she also saw how Thatcher, with a few sentences and a couple of nods, had changed the way the system treated them. His power could save her child in this moment, but it could also destroy Naomi's life if he ever chose. That fear wasn't irrational. It was raw truth. Naomi turned her head and saw Thatcher standing quiet, his eyes not locked on the child but on the doorway like a man holding a line. In that silence, Naomi understood he wasn't a soft savior. He was a man used to controlling outcomes. Tonight the outcome was Rowan still breathing, but the price was Naomi taking one more step into his orbit, where the boundary between being helped and being held was as thin as the breath she'd just gotten back. Rowan was discharged when dawn was already close. The little girl dozed in Naomi's arms, the scent of nebulizer medicine still clinging to her hair. Maisie walked tight beside her mother like a small, sturdy shadow. Thatcher moved ahead of them, not saying much, guiding them through quieter corridors to avoid curious eyes. But even with all his effort to keep everything low profile, Naomi still felt an invisible thread tying them to a danger she couldn't name, because on the ride back her phone kept vibrating. First Priya, then an unfamiliar number, then Priya again. Naomi answered Priya as the car rolled into the garage. Priya spoke fast, saying the system had just flagged a new risk signal. Someone had filed an anonymous report claiming Naomi was living with a man who had a violent record and illegal activity. Priya said she didn't believe an anonymous accusation, but it was enough to push CPS to move up a visit, possibly within the next few days. Priya told Naomi to prepare everything: the contract, the job letter, Rowan's discharge paperwork, the girls' school schedule, and most important, a consistent account. Not to lie, but to keep the system from misreading gaps. Naomi listened and felt like her insides dropped. She tried to keep her voice even in front of Maisie, but inside her head only one sentence repeated: "They found me. They're coming. They'll walk into this place. They'll step past the thick glass, look at her like a file, look at her children like a risk. And if they smelled the underworld on Thatcher, they wouldn't need any other reason to reach in." When the call ended, Naomi gripped her phone until it hurt. She went into the bedroom, laid Rowan down, pulled the blanket up, then sat on the floor beside the bed as if lowering herself could make fear miss her. Maisie stood in the doorway watching her mother. Naomi said everything was fine, but Maisie didn't believe that kind of fine. She only asked whether they were coming to take them. Naomi went stiff, then pulled the girl into her arms and said she wouldn't let that happen. But her own words sounded like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Outside, Thatcher was on the phone in his office. The door wasn't fully shut, and his voice, low but edged, carried through the crack in fragments Naomi could still catch. He told Graham the anonymous allegation had appeared too perfectly timed, that it was a dirty move, that Mason Vargo was leaking the story, and if they wanted to pull federal pressure into this, they'd use Naomi as bait. Graham replied that someone had sent an anonymous packet to a company partner, including photos of Naomi and the two girls entering the building, with a caption calling her the new lover of a man who wasn't clean. Naomi heard the word photos and her heart tightened. She didn't know where they'd been taken, but she understood something brutal. She and her children had become evidence in a war she never agreed to join. Thatcher's voice hardened as he said Mason couldn't pull this alone without a buyer on the other end, that a rival was probing the perimeter of the property, testing the security edge, watching his reactions, and what they needed wasn't Naomi. What they needed was Thatcher's reflex when Naomi was threatened. Hearing that, a piece slid into place. Naomi stopped seeing Thatcher as a wealthy businessman with lawyers and contracts. She saw him as a man who lived in a world where photos and anonymous reports were weapons, where a name like Mason Vargo could make systems pivot. Naomi felt her skin turn cold, because she'd fled one violent man to avoid losing her children, and now she was standing beside a different kind of danger. Organized danger, networked danger, danger that could bend a hospital and a school without raising its voice. Naomi rose slowly, closed the bedroom door so Maisie wouldn't hear more, then opened her bag of documents and stacked everything neatly. The employment contract, the job letter, Rowan's discharge papers, Priya's number, the school list. The cash she still held like an anchor. She didn't vent. She didn't fall apart. She began to prepare the way someone prepares when she's lived long enough to know panic is what leaves tracks. Naomi pulled out a small travel bag and packed the essentials. Rowan's medication, a few outfits for both girls, a small notebook with phone numbers, copies of the most important papers. She set the bag close to the door like an exit plan, then looked at her sleeping girls and knew she was doing the most painful thing again, preparing to run, not because she wanted to, but because she had to save her children before an adult game crushed them. Outside, Thatcher was still speaking, his voice dropping so low Naomi couldn't catch every word, but one sentence cut through the air like a blade. If Mason wanted to play with children, Mason wouldn't be allowed to live under Thatcher's rules anymore. Naomi shivered, because that wasn't the voice of a legitimate employer. That was the voice of a real mafia boss. And in that moment, fear inside her took such a clear shape, she had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound. She understood she was in a thick glass house, luxurious and safe. But this kind of safety could shatter at any moment if the war outside needed an explosion. And Naomi, with two small girls, couldn't allow her children to become bait just because she had trusted an agreement built on boundaries. Before dawn, when the city was still caught between two breaths, Naomi rose in the dark and dressed Rowan with movements as quiet as water. She didn't turn on the main lights. She used only the dim glow from the kitchen, so the thick glass wouldn't throw reflections like a signal. She slipped the inhaler into the bag, folded the blanket neatly as if returning the room to someone else, then went to Maisie's bed and whispered her name. Maisie opened her eyes instantly, like she hadn't slept at all. Her gaze didn't ask why. It asked in silence whether they were running again. Naomi gave a small nod, her lips trembling but making no sound. Maisie sat up and hugged the small backpack she'd packed the night before, the habit of a child who didn't trust tomorrow. Rowan was still drained from the hospital, her wheeze returning when Naomi lifted her. Naomi pressed her face to the child's forehead and whispered, "Just a little longer. Then Mom will find somewhere warmer." She knew she was doing something cruel to herself, walking away from a place that was clean, stocked with medicine, backed by paperwork. But she also knew that if CPS arrived and saw the invisible cord tying her to Thatcher's war, they wouldn't listen to a poor mother's explanations. They would only hear the system's alarm bell. Naomi stepped into the living area and cast a final glance at the towering glass walls. The city below was still cold and distant, as if no one knew a mother was pulling her children off a life ring because she was afraid the life ring had been wired with a bomb. She found a scrap of paper and wrote a few short lines, her handwriting shaky but clear. "Thank you for helping my child breathe. I'm sorry I stepped into your life in a way that made your trouble heavier. I have to leave before someone uses us to hurt you or hurt my children." She slid the note under a cup of water like she was placing a confession on an altar. Then she gathered the stack of important documents, shoved them into her bag, locked the girl's bedroom door from the inside on reflex, then unlocked it immediately to remind herself she wasn't trapped. They moved through the thick carpeted hallway. Naomi carried Rowan. Maisie pulled the bag. The private elevator lowered them into the garage in a silence that felt too clean. Naomi's heartbeat sounded loud as shoes on tile. She used the keycard Thatcher had left behind to open doors, and each swipe made her brace for an alarm. But the system didn't ring. It simply opened like a door that didn't ask questions. The silver sedan still sat where it had been. The key was in a small box Thatcher had shown her. Naomi understood he'd prepared it so she could leave without being blocked, and that made her grateful and afraid at the same time, because it meant he'd predicted she would do this. Naomi drove out without turning on the radio, without calling anyone, holding the road the way a drowning person holds a rope. Outside, the wind cut skin. Rowan coughed a few times and sagged against Naomi's shoulder, her wheeze matching the cold. Maisie wrapped her arms around her sister, eyes red, but she didn't cry. She stared forward like a small soldier. When the car finally cleared the building's zone, Naomi allowed herself one hard breath, but the relief lasted only seconds. because she knew she was leaving behind not just a luxury apartment, but a legal structure that could have protected her from CPS. She was choosing to run again and praying she ran in the right direction. In the penthouse, Thatcher didn't register her absence by the sound of a door. He registered it as a gap in the security rhythm, a door sensor triggered before dawn. A vehicle leaving the garage outside the schedule. He walked into the living area and saw the note beneath the cup. He read it and didn't explode. He just stood there for a long time, jaw clenched as if swallowing something bitter and hot. He understood Naomi hadn't left to betray him. She'd left to keep her children safe, and that truth meant he couldn't treat her like a risk that needed to be crushed. He called Graham Phelps immediately, voice low, and ordered the legal protection activated. Send the job confirmation and the new contact address to Priya. Document clearly that Naomi had a contract and was in a stabilization process. Tell the school to hold the transfer file. If CPS knocked, they needed proof Naomi had tried to do it the right way. Thatcher also ordered his security team not to tail Naomi like a shadow, not to spook her, only to use lawful remote monitoring to ensure no one intercepted her car, because if Naomi was seen being followed by his people, CPS would have even more reason to grind her down. He looked back at the thick glass room and, for the first time, saw how meaningless luxury was if it couldn't keep a mother in place through real safety. And even though his instinct was to pull her back and lock her down, he chose the harder path. He would build a legal umbrella wide enough that Naomi wouldn't be torn apart by the system just because she'd been afraid at the right time. Chicago opened in front of Naomi like a maze with no signs. She drove the silver sedan to a neighborhood far from downtown, where low buildings and small corner groceries made her feel like she could dissolve into the crowd. She didn't go back to the old motel because she knew it was the first place anyone would guess. She found a church that ran a daytime shelter program, then a room rented by the night in an area with steady foot traffic. Every time she stopped the car, she shut the engine off immediately, watched the rearview mirror longer than necessary, and every time she lifted Rowan out of the seat, she heard that tight wheeze return in the cold, like a countdown clock lodged in the child's chest. Maisie held her sister, eyes scanning the room the way you scan for traps. She didn't ask why her mother had left the warm place. She only asked whether there was still medicine. Naomi nodded, but the doses left in the bag scared her more than sirens, because medicine wasn't a home. Medicine only bought time. Priya called back around midday, her voice still calm but tighter, saying CPS had scheduled an earlier check than expected, and because Naomi was no longer at the address she'd given the school, the system could log her as uncooperative. Priya said, "Naomi, you're making your file look worse. I submitted the job letter and the housing contract, but if you disappear out of contact, they'll read that as a risk sign." Naomi stood in a church hallway holding Rowan as she slept in short dozes, thin soup and damp clothes in the air around her making the thick glass penthouse feel like a dream she'd woken from. She told Priya she was trying to protect her children, that she couldn't stay there anymore. Priya asked where there was. Naomi went silent because she didn't want to say Thatcher's name, didn't want anyone recording a connection. Priya exhaled and said, "I'm not asking out of curiosity. I'm asking because if you don't give me an address, I can't protect you from the system." Naomi ended the call shaking, then forced herself upright, smiled at Maisie, and said everything was fine. But when night fell, fine broke apart. Naomi saw a black car parked a short distance from the rented room. Lights off, engine running, and a man stepped out. He didn't enter the building. He only stood and looked up at the line of windows like he was taking inventory. Naomi yanked the curtain closed and held her breath, heart pounding so hard she was afraid Rowan would wake from the sound of her mother's heartbeat. She moved again that same night, drove through several areas, and stopped in a 24-hour supermarket lot, sitting there until morning. Maisie slept folded into Naomi's shoulder. Rowan coughed and wheezed. Naomi pressed the inhaler, and every puff felt like another beat of fear. When morning came, Naomi knew she wasn't only being tracked by paperwork. Someone was following her by another method. Repeating car loops. Eyes that didn't belong to shoppers. The hard, prickling sense in the back of her neck that someone was measuring distance to her children. Naomi began to understand what Thatcher had told her and she hadn't wanted to hear. Someone was trying to drag him into the light, and she was only the cord. It wasn't that she mattered to them. It wasn't even that her daughters mattered. What they wanted was Thatcher's reaction when the cord got yanked. Anger rose in Naomi, not at Thatcher, but at a world where children were used as leverage. She called Priya back, and this time her voice didn't try to sound fine. She asked directly, If CPS comes and I don't have a stable address, will I lose my kids? Priya didn't answer with comfort. Priya answered with truth. The risk was very high if Naomi kept moving, if the school kept reporting absences, if Rowan didn't have continuous medical appointments. Priya said, "Naomi, you need to choose a place and stand still. Even if it's hard. Even if you're scared. Because the system only trusts what it can measure on paper." Naomi ended the call and sat in the car watching her girls sleep. Rowan's hair lay tangled across her forehead. Maisie's hand still held her sister tight like a vow. Naomi understood that running had saved them when the enemy was an old, violent man and a cheap apartment door. But now the enemy was a network, dirty rumors, patient shadows, and running only made her a clearer target. She opened her bag and pulled out the scrap of paper with Thatcher's number she'd copied back at the motel. Her finger hovered over the call button like it was hovering over a cliff edge, because calling meant returning to his orbit, admitting she couldn't do this alone, placing her children near a Mafia boss whose real voice she'd heard in the night. But not calling meant placing her children in front of a system that could take them with a stamp if she didn't stop moving. Naomi closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, then opened them and looked at her daughters. And in that moment, she understood the real choice wasn't pride versus help. It was losing her children to paperwork, or facing the man she feared so she could keep them inside her arms. Naomi's call didn't last long. She only said her name, said the girls were in the car, said someone was following her, and her voice broke on the last word like she hated needing help more than she hated the cold biting at Rowan's lungs. Thatcher didn't ask why she'd left. He didn't ask where she was in a blaming way. He asked one question only. "What do you see? What color? Can you remember the plate?" Naomi looked into the rearview mirror and saw the black car still there, far enough to pretend it wasn't, close enough to live under her skin like a threat. She read off a few characters. Thatcher told her not to leave the car. Drive to a location he was sending right now. A 24-hour gas station near a major intersection, crowded, bright, covered in cameras, and most important, on a patrol route police often passed. Naomi drove there, hands clamped on the wheel until her knuckles whitened. Maisie woke and asked where they were going. Naomi didn't explain. She only said she was taking them somewhere safe, and Maisie pulled Rowan closer. Rowan coughed and wheezed. Naomi pressed the inhaler, then glanced at her phone and saw a message from an unknown number, one short line that knew too much and felt too cold. "Don't think running means you're free." Naomi's spine went ice. She parked exactly where Thatcher told her, directly under a camera. She didn't kill the engine. She didn't step out. She scanned the lot and spotted two men near the convenience store entrance, pretending to buy coffee while their eyes kept cutting toward her car. Naomi almost called Priya on reflex, then stopped. Priya was paperwork. This was a knife. Thatcher didn't arrive in a black car with a convoy. He arrived in an SUV carrying the logo of a legitimate private security company with amber utility lights like a work crew. Another vehicle followed. Two uniformed men stepped out first, their movements procedural, like security staff responding to a commercial site incident. They positioned themselves to block lines of sight and create a discreet corridor for Naomi without startling the whole gas station. Thatcher got out last. Dark coat, expression empty. But when his eyes landed on Rowan struggling to breathe, something in his gaze tightened. He opened Naomi's door without touching her and said, "Get out, follow me." Naomi climbed out, holding Rowan. Maisie dragged the backpack, eyes locked on the uniforms, then flicking to the two strangers by the store. Thatcher didn't confront them right away. He guided Naomi and the girls into the security vehicle, shut the door, locked it, then turned back toward the station. Right then, a police patrol car rolled past. No siren, only slowing when they noticed a security team on site. Thatcher lifted a hand in a way that spoke to process, not a Mafia boss blocking the road. One of the security employees approached the officer, pointed out the gas station cameras, and explained there were suspicious individuals watching a customer and sending threatening texts. The officer stopped, stepped out, and the two men's faces shifted instantly. They didn't want a record. They didn't want to be logged. They didn't want questions. They started backing toward the black car, but Thatcher had already anticipated their exit. A second security vehicle was positioned at the main way out without drawing attention, forcing the black car to loop toward a side lane with fewer cameras, and that was exactly what Thatcher wanted, because he didn't need a public explosion. He needed to sever one link and see where the cord led. Naomi watched through the window as the officer asked for identification, saw the men try to smile, try to speak like everything was normal, then peel away with irritation. Thatcher didn't chase them with open violence. He gave a tiny nod to someone on his team, and that person disappeared like a shadow. Naomi didn't see what happened next. But minutes later, Thatcher returned, his eyes darker, like he'd just shut a door inside his own mind. He told Naomi they were leaving now. Naomi asked who they were. Thatcher answered short. They worked for someone who wanted her gone exactly while CPS was watching, so her file would collapse, and so he would be dragged out of his legal cover. Naomi swallowed hard, realizing her fear had been justified, but also realizing he was doing something she hadn't expected. He wasn't pulling her back with chains. He was pulling her back with cameras, uniforms, patrol routes, with a system that created proof she was being stalked, not a runaway. As the vehicle moved, Thatcher sat in the front seat, without turning to watch Naomi like a guard. He laid out the rules in plain terms. She would have a new temporary place where she could stay still for CPS. She could lock the door from the inside. She could call Priya whenever she wanted. If she still wanted to leave after things were safe, she only had to say one sentence, and it would be done. Maisie heard him. The girl still didn't fully trust him, but she looked at her mother, then at Thatcher, and something new appeared in her eyes. She understood this man could make people disappear without a sound, but he chose not to do it in front of children. He chose law and light as the cover. His violence was still there, like a blade hidden under cloth, but it was controlled. And Naomi, with fear still burning and Rowan's breathing still rough, began to understand he was trying to keep her close with safety and boundaries, not with a cage. After getting Naomi and the girls into a safer apartment on the corporate line, Thatcher didn't stay behind and create the feeling of being watched. He only made sure the door could be locked from the inside. Priya's contact number was taped to the refrigerator. Rowan's medication would cover the next few days, and the clinic appointment had already been scheduled. Then he left like a shadow, returning to where shadows belonged. Except this time, his mind carried one new objective. He wasn't allowed to fail. He had to separate Naomi from anything dirty before the system could attach her name to any file. At the logistics company office, Graham Phelps was waiting, his face worn from calls and sleepless pages. He reported that someone anonymous had sent more material to an associate on the partner council, including photos of Naomi leaving the building at dawn, with a suggestion that Thatcher was using dirty money to shield a woman with small children. Graham said it plainly. This was a smear campaign designed to crack the legal shell and pull federal pressure onto the company. Thatcher didn't ask who was behind it. He asked how far the locked proof tying Mason Vargo went. Graham opened a file. Inside were internal access logs to the drop schedule. One login from Mason's device at the exact time window only 3 people were supposed to know. A chain of short calls from a secondary number Mason used to contact a third party. A warehouse camera excerpt showing the route coordinator disappearing after meeting Mason in the parking lot. Thatcher read each line the way you read a traitor's face. He didn't explode or slam a desk. He went colder, because anger was predictable, and coldness was what made people die without understanding why. The ledger, the shipping and reconciliation book that could bury Thatcher if it leaked, suddenly became a knife he could grip from the other side. Thatcher ordered every copy of the ledger pulled into a clean place, access locked down, and only one version kept, just enough to serve as bait. He didn't want Mason to know he already knew. He wanted Mason to believe Thatcher was still rattled by the legal shell and by Naomi, so Mason would expose more of the cord. Graham said there was one way to reduce federal risk: a controlled sacrifice, meaning they proactively pushed out a few small links, a few low-exposure routes, so agencies could see a win and ease off the core. It was how empires survived in this city. Thatcher looked at Graham and asked the price. Graham said the price was Thatcher being scrutinized harder, signing more papers, accepting stricter audits, appearing more often as the public face of the legal side, while the dark side would have to cut off a few routes that had always paid fast. Thatcher went quiet. In that quiet, there was the sound of metal sliding against metal. Then he nodded, because this time he understood that if federal pressure tightened further, the first thing crushed wouldn't be a shipment line. It would be Naomi, a mother placed in the wrong spot inside this war. Thatcher said they would do the plan, but on one condition. Every document tied to Naomi had to be standardized immediately. Every housing and medical support payment had to flow through legitimate channels. Not $1 moved through shadow methods. Not one of his people approached Naomi outside a human resources or lawful security role. Graham asked what Thatcher would do about Mason. Thatcher answered in one short sentence. Mason would walk into the trap with his own mouth, and when he did, Thatcher would lock him with evidence, not a corpse, at least until federal eyes turned elsewhere. Graham watched Thatcher like he was watching a man rewrite the rules inside his own empire, but he didn't object, because he understood the new vulnerability wasn't like the old ones. It had a child's eyes and a wheezing breath. Thatcher called a closed meeting with a small group from the legal side only, and demanded access logs, cameras, emails, anything that could pin Mason to leaking and internal manipulation, and at the same time, he released a false signal that the ledger was being moved to another location to protect it from federal scrutiny, a piece of information tempting enough for Mason to bite. Thatcher knew it would draw attention toward him, might even give federal investigators another reason to look harder, but he accepted it, because if he let the legal side scrutinize him more, he could build a legal wall thick enough for Naomi to stand behind without being mislabeled as an accomplice. And for the first time in his life, this boss accepted a kind of risk that wasn't about winning money or territory. It was about a mother being able to watch her child sleep without fearing a knock carrying a stamp. The day CPS came didn't arrive with sirens or movie drama. It arrived as an appointment confirmed by email and a knock at the door exactly on time, clean and cold like procedure. Naomi had been ready since before sunrise. She wiped down the kitchen surfaces again, lined up the girl's shoes neatly, put Rowan's medication into a labeled plastic container, taped the daily routine schedule onto the refrigerator like a shield. Maisie wore her school uniform, hair brushed smooth, but her eyes were pulled tight as wire because she'd heard her mother say CPS, and she hadn't forgotten the nights they ran. Rowan sat in a chair, hugging a stuffed bear, wheezing on and off. Naomi refused to let that wheeze become evidence against her. She set a glass of warm water beside Rowan and placed the hospital discharge papers on top of the folder stack, where they couldn't be missed. Priya Desai arrived a few minutes early. She didn't show up with warmth. She showed up with the kind of focus that understood a file could save or destroy a family. Priya looked at Naomi and gave a small nod like a reminder to breathe, then positioned herself like an official support person, not a friend. When the door opened, a CPS worker stepped inside, coat neat, name badge bright, a notebook in one hand and a tablet in the other. Their voice was polite but not soft. They introduced themselves and said the purpose was to assess the living environment and caregiving capacity, verify the truancy report, and verify Rowan's medical condition. Naomi's throat turned dry, but she remembered Priya's instruction. Don't explain in long circles. Put evidence on the table. She invited them to sit, her hands steady because she'd practiced in the mirror all night, and she laid the paperwork down like she was setting a new life on a flat surface. She started with school, re-enrollment confirmations for Maisie and Rowan, a note from the homeroom teacher outlining support, grades and a makeup schedule to cover missed days. Then medical, discharge papers, the nebulizer prescription, the pediatric appointment date, notes about an asthma management plan. Naomi spoke evenly and said Rowan had an underlying condition. She'd been unstable before and had missed follow-ups, but now she had fixed appointments and reliable transportation to get her child there on time. She didn't blame anyone. She took responsibility like a mother trying to stand upright. The CPS worker asked about the address and income. Naomi presented her employment contract, the job confirmation letter, her first paycheck stub, and a document confirming the temporary housing as legitimate. She explained the daily structure, drop-off times, work hours, sleep, meals, as if she were presenting a system instead of a life. Maisie sat beside her mother, back straight, eyes fixed on the CPS worker's hands like if they touched her mother's papers, she would spring up and block them. Priya watched, occasionally adding a clarifying detail at the right moment, not making Naomi look coached, but helping her speak the system's language. When the CPS worker asked who owned the housing, Naomi didn't say Thatcher's name immediately. She looked at Priya. Priya gave a small nod. Naomi said the residence belonged to her legitimate employer's company, and the contact person responsible was Graham Phelps. Then the doorbell sounded again. Thatcher appeared. He didn't enter like a powerful owner. He paused at the threshold and asked permission in one short sentence. He introduced himself like a business representative, said he was Naomi's employer and responsible for the work environment and for supporting a schedule that allowed Naomi to care for her children. He didn't speak about feelings or charity. He spoke about procedure, contracts, compliance. He added a written confirmation that Naomi had the right to leave the housing at any time without obstruction, and that any support flowed through lawful channels. The CPS worker looked at Thatcher and asked whether there were surveillance cameras inside the apartment. Thatcher answered that the building had standard security in common areas, but there were no cameras in Naomi's private space, and if needed, he would allow verification of that information. They asked about Naomi previously disappearing from her old address. Thatcher didn't answer for her. He said only that since Naomi signed the contract, her work schedule and school transport had been recorded. She had been on time and compliant, and the company could provide written verification. Then came the hardest part. The CPS worker said because the file included an anonymous report about third-party risk, they would recommend a period of periodic supervision and unannounced checks, and they required Naomi to commit to not changing addresses without notice and to keep the children away from high-risk environments. Naomi heard unannounced checks and felt her heart drop, because unannounced meant she couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't live by old reflex. She was about to protest, but Priya rested her hand near the folder stack like a reminder that pushing back now would only trigger suspicion. Thatcher spoke before Naomi could. He said he accepted it. He accepted CPS oversight. He accepted lawful intrusion into his schedule at the level necessary, as long as it preserved Naomi's custody and created stability for the girls. The room went silent for a beat, because a man like Thatcher didn't usually accept scrutiny. He didn't usually allow anyone to write notes about his life. But he said it as if it were obvious. Naomi looked at him and saw no weak surrender in his eyes, only a cold, clear, ethical decision. He would be watched so a family wouldn't be torn apart. The CPS worker took notes. Priya added that the supervision plan needed to be specific and not punitive. They agreed on timeframes and criteria. Then the CPS worker stood, looked at Naomi, and said that at present they were not removing the children, but they would monitor. Naomi nodded, throat too tight to speak any thanks. When the door shut, Maisie finally exhaled. Tears fell, and she wiped them away fast like she was afraid of looking weak. Naomi gathered both girls into her arms, hands shaking because she'd just slipped free of a pair of scissors. Thatcher stood a short distance away, holding the role he'd just played, but Naomi knew he'd done something that didn't belong to Mafia instinct. He had let the system look straight at him, and that choice, cold as it was, had saved them in the cleanest way she'd ever been saved. After the CPS visit, the apartment settled into that kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Naomi sat at the kitchen table watching the girls eat cookies like they'd survived an invisible war. Maisie was still sniffing but forcing herself to act normal. Rowan leaned back in her chair, breathing more evenly, eyes half closed from exhaustion. Priya left after reminding Naomi to keep the schedule, keep the paperwork, and most of all not let fear push her back into the old habit of disappearing. When the door shut, Naomi assumed Thatcher would leave right away, the way he always kept distance, but this time he didn't. He stepped closer and set a thin stack of papers on the table, light in weight, but heavy like a new door. Naomi stared at it, and her heart tightened on instinct, because papers had been used to bind her before. Thatcher said, short and flat, "This isn't a contract that locks you in. This is your right to leave." Naomi didn't understand. She asked what he was talking about. Thatcher pulled out a chair and sat across from her, not too close, his voice low as he explained that starting today she would have a separate account in her own name. Her pay would go straight into that account. No one from his side would have access. Graham had already prepared the process. She would have a card, a PIN, and the right to keep everything that belonged to her in a place no one could take. Naomi looked at him like he was offering something that didn't fit logic, because in her life, men with power always wanted to keep power. Thatcher continued. He said she would have a written document stating that she and the girls could leave this residence at any time, without explanation, without permission, without being followed, without pressure. If she chose to go, the lawful security team would only escort her to a safe location she selected and then stop. No tailing, no calls, no debt reminders. Naomi heard the words without being followed, and her eyes heated, because she'd lived too long with the feeling of someone always standing behind her. Thatcher slid another page forward. A safety plan, Priya's number, a legal aid hotline, the address of a verified safe shelter, Rowan's clinic schedule, and one short line stating that if any external threats occurred, Naomi had the right to call the police and request protection like any citizen, not call Thatcher's people. Thatcher said it plainly. "You're not my property. You're a mother with rights. If you stay here, It has to be because you choose it, not because you're trapped. Naomi couldn't answer right away. Her throat tightened, because that sentence touched a place deep in her where she'd believed she no longer had the right to choose. Maisie watched from the table, suspicion sharp in her face, and she asked if her mother could really leave. Thatcher turned toward her, gave one nod, and said yes. You can leave, and if you want to leave, no one will stop you. The simplicity of it quieted Maisie, not the silence of being pressed down, but the silence of a child hearing a powerful man say freedom out loud without demanding anything back. Naomi picked up the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she read line by line, saw signatures, dates, her name placed at the center like a person with authority instead of a person being temporarily kept. She looked up and asked why he was doing this. Thatcher didn't dodge. He said, because you won't trust me if you don't have an exit. I don't need someone staying because she's scared. I need someone staying because her freedom is respected. Naomi heard the word need, and her caution stayed, but it was a different kind of caution now. It wasn't fear of being hit or locked in. It was the carefulness of someone being handed power and not yet used to holding it. Thatcher stood. He didn't wait for thanks. He said tomorrow Graham would take her to the bank to complete everything, and she could call Priya to get these documents added to her file, so CPS would see she had the right to leave and wasn't being controlled, and that would help her more than any reassurance ever could. Then he walked to the door and paused like he was weighing something. Finally, he said, very quietly, I've lived by keeping everything in my hands, but I don't want to hold you that way. Naomi watched his back disappear, and the feeling in her chest was no longer only gratitude and fear. It began to carry something else, softer and more dangerous, a quiet respect, because for the first time in her life, if there was affection at all, it wasn't born from being rescued. It was born from being given the power to leave. The days that followed didn't turn into a fairy tale just because Naomi had paperwork in her hands and Rowan had regular appointments. It felt more like a house rebuilt through discipline, through schedules and small repeated habits, until her body stopped flinching every time a phone vibrated. Naomi started working her shifts like a legitimate employee, pay landing in her separate account the way Thatcher had promised. She went to the bank herself, signed every form under Graham's instructions, sent copies to Priya to be filed into the CPS record, and each time she completed one more step, she felt steadier, as if the ground beneath her feet was no longer sliding. In the mornings, she walked Maisie to school and stood at the gate listening to her talk about homework and new friends, small stories like colored paper stuck onto a life that had been all gray. Rowan went to the doctor on schedule. The pediatrician adjusted the plan, taught Naomi how to spot early warning signs, and the little girl began sleeping deeper, coughing less, sometimes giggling because her inhaler had a moon sticker on it. Naomi was still afraid, but fear didn't swallow her the same way because she had a file, a routine, evidence. Thatcher didn't enter their room unless he was invited. He kept distance like a rule, but his presence didn't disappear. It lived in small, quiet luxuries that didn't show off. A pot of hot soup set in the kitchen right when Naomi came home late. A softer blanket replaced when Rowan ran cold. A children's book appearing on the table with no explanation of who bought it. And once, when Maisie spilled a glass of water on the rug, she froze like she was bracing for punishment. Thatcher only handed her a towel and said, "Wipe it up, and it's done." His voice as neutral as weather. That calm confused Maisie more than yelling ever could, because she didn't know how to defend herself against a man who didn't use power to scare children. Naomi watched those moments and felt something in her change, like warmth spreading slowly across cold glass. Not sudden, not easy to name. Just a little less checking the locks at night, a little less stuffing papers under her pillow in the morning, and whenever she thought about her right to leave, she didn't picture running anymore. She pictured the key that made it possible to stay. Thatcher changed too, in ways you might miss unless you watched him for a long time. He was still cold, still spare with words, but he began appearing at the right moments, not to control, but to be present. He sat at the edge of the kitchen table reading documents while Naomi helped Maisie with homework, not interfering, simply there like a wall against wind. He asked Rowan if breathing hurt today, a short, awkward question, and Rowan nodded, then asked if he slept, and Thatcher paused for a beat before saying yes. Naomi saw that exchange, and her chest tightened in a way that was both painful and warm, but beneath the thick glass, the dark hadn't left. The security system still logged small irregularities from time to time. A strange call to the company line, someone asking about Thatcher's schedule and hanging up. An anonymous email to a partner dragging Naomi's name back into the light. Priya reported that CPS would still do at least one unannounced check because the file had once been flagged. Naomi heard that and didn't panic the way she used to, but her throat still went dry, and Thatcher understood it as legal aftershock Mason, and whoever stood behind him wanted to exhaust Naomi and force him into exposure. One evening, while Naomi washed dishes, she heard Thatcher's voice through the crack of his office door. He told Graham they had enough legal evidence to lock Mason down: access logs, camera footage, money movement, even contact with the rival side. But one last blow was still coming: a packet of material being prepared to push out and trigger heavier federal pressure right before Mason got taken. Thatcher said he would close the last dangerous door, meaning he would cut one remaining dirty route himself, hand part of it over to authorities under the controlled sacrifice plan to buy Naomi's clean separation from suspicion. Naomi stood still with water running over her hands and didn't even feel the cold. She understood he was getting ready to accept more scrutiny, more risk, not for pride, but because if that door stayed open, poison wind would blow straight into the lives of two little girls. She walked into the office without knocking, then stopped at the threshold, because she'd learned to respect his boundaries the way he respected hers. Thatcher looked up, his gaze sharp but not driving her away. Naomi didn't ask for details. She only asked, "If you do this, will my girls and I be safe?" Thatcher held her eyes for a long time, then said, "I will make sure." And in the silence after that sentence, Naomi realized what was growing between them wasn't built on sweet promises. It was built on hard choices, disciplined choices. And that made it frightening in a different way. Frightening because it might be real. The final blow didn't come as gunfire in the street. It came as paperwork sliding across a table like a thin blade. An anonymous packet was sent to the right contacts at the right moment to tempt federal eyes into digging deeper. But this time, Thatcher didn't run. He closed the door on purpose, before the poisoned wind could push into the house. Graham executed the controlled sacrifice plan, pushing out one low-risk route with clean, obvious evidence so authorities could claim a neat win, while the company's legitimate core was tightened with audits, compliance procedures, and signatures that no longer carried the scent of loopholes. Mason Vargo was locked down through access logs, camera footage, money trails, and contact with a rival. When he was called in, he still tried to smile like a man who believed he had a way out. But Thatcher had turned the ledger from a noose into a clamp, forcing him into a corner without noise. The legal side held him with files and a warrant. The underworld made sure he wouldn't get a second chance to move. Thatcher's recovery team eventually located the missing route coordinator at a remote site, securing the final testimony needed to bury Mason's career forever. Everything happened fast and clean, not letting Naomi and the girls see violence, only letting them see the result as the shadows around their lives began to thin. CPS completed one unannounced check as scheduled. Priya was there. Naomi presented Maisie's updated school schedule, Rowan's updated medical records, her pay stubs, her mailing address, her daily routine plan, and the written exit rights documents. The CPS worker noted the stability, concluded Naomi was cooperative and capable of providing care, removed the high-risk flag, moved the case to light monitoring, then closed it. Naomi had to bite her lip to keep from crying in front of her child, because she had kept her two little girls with something she'd thought she didn't have, with structure, with the right paperwork, and with standing still long enough for the system to see the truth. Time passed. Rowan warmed back into herself. The asthma attacks no longer stole the whole night. Maisie stopped jolting awake at every small sound. She was still watchful, but the watchfulness became less sharp, like a knife set down on the table instead of held to a throat. Naomi shifted from survival into living. She had her own account, a real job, a stable address, and most of all, choice written on paper instead of hanging from a promise. On a cold evening, sleet and snow clung to the windows like dust. Inside the kitchen, hot soup rose in slow steam, the smell of carrots and onions reminding Naomi of church days. Except this time she wasn't standing in a line waiting for food. She was standing in a kitchen lit just enough, stirring the pot, listening to Maisie talk about class, listening to Rowan laugh because the spoon made bubbles. Thatcher came in without noise, hung his coat, washed his hands, then set another thin stack of papers in front of Naomi. Not a ring, not a flashy proposal. A shared life commitment built on boundaries and freedom, stating clearly Naomi's right to privacy, her separate finances, her right to leave at any time without conditions, without being followed, without threats, and his obligations as a partner, not an owner. He said he wouldn't promise to become a gentleman, but he would promise to become a man who controlled his power with discipline, so this home wouldn't become a cage. Naomi read it, and her hands didn't shake from fear anymore. She looked up at him and saw a man ruthless to his enemies, who had learned how to be careful with what was fragile. She didn't say anything romantic. She only said she was staying because she chose to. And Thatcher nodded like he understood that was the only sentence worth trusting. Beyond the glass, Chicago was still cold. The city was still loud in the distance. But in the kitchen there was soup steam. There were 2 children who could breathe in peace. There was a mother who wasn't running anymore. And there was a man willing to be watched to keep a clean roof over their heads. This story doesn't teach us that love is magic. It reminds us that kindness has to come with structure, that freedom is only real when there's an exit, and that sometimes peace doesn't arrive because life suddenly softens, but because we dare to set boundaries, dare to do the right things, and dare to stand steady until fear no longer controls each breath. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share to spread stories that move the heart, and to listen to more engaging videos every day. And tell us how this story made you feel. Did it bring you back to a real moment in your own life, when you had to choose between fear and standing firm? Leave a comment so we can hear what's in the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, joyful days, and peace. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.